Merry Christmas, everyone. So today, to celebrate Christmas, I'm going to be doing a video looking at all 10 Formula One teams and one thing that they most want for Christmas. And in that case, that's kind of the one thing that I think they probably want the most going into 2024. So we're going to start at number 10 in reverse Constructors' Championship order with Haas, and we're going to finish with Red Bull. So I think for Haas, the one thing that they're going to want more than anything for Christmas is race pace. The qualifying pace last year was honestly not too bad. It was about in the same ballpark as the three teams above them. And honestly, with Hulkenberg, he had quite a few really amazing qualifying performances, getting himself up into Q3, for example. But all of that hard work in qualifying would just go undone because they had no race pace. So I think for Haas, if they want to climb out of last place in the constructors next year, they're really going to have to try to improve that. I think a lot of that improvement is going to have to come from the suspension. Now, moving on to Sauber, I think for Sauber, I'm going to go with this. Upgrades. So we know that there's basically 2 years until Audi come in. And for Sauber, they're going to really, kick F1 Sauber, I guess they're going to be called in 2024. But for Sauber, they came into 2022 honestly pretty good. A midfield team at the start of the new regulations, and they've basically just gone backwards ever since. Through 2022 and into 2023, they kind of fell further and further off the pack of the other cars as less and less money has basically been invested in the team, as they've just been holding on, waiting for Audi to come. And for Bottas and Zhou, there's only so much they can do. So what they really need is upgrades on the car to kind of help get that car up to where it can be. They don't really have the same problem that Haas does, where their qualifying is at least okay, reasonable, but then they massively fall off. They have their pace across qualifying in the race is just pretty mediocre, pretty poor across the board. Now, moving on to AlphaTauri, I don't have a magnet for AlphaTauri because we know they're changing their name to something Racing Bulls, and I don't have a magnet yet. So we're just sticking with an AlphaTauri there. So for AlphaTauri, I think the one big thing that's pretty obvious to me is the red parts. The Red Bull parts work. So we know that next year they're going to be more tightly integrated with their parent team Red Bull, and that they're going to be using as many parts as possible with next year's car. So for AlphaTauri, we know they're getting those Red Bull parts, and now the question is, how well do they work with the package, the aerodynamic package that AlphaTauri bring? I think that's going to be the real big question. Of course, I think at best it could be AlphaTauri moving up to, Alpine level. I think is probably best case scenario. Of course, if they don't work at all, they aren't able to understand the parts, how to extract pace out of those parts, they could fall down to, Haas level. So for AlphaTauri, they're really going to be hoping that those Red Bull parts work well for them. Now, number 7, Williams. I think, again, pretty clear. Sargent. So for Williams, I've got Sargent Development. I think they were quite fortunate this year that the gap between Alpine and themselves was so large that you can't really justify, or you can't make the argument that Sargent cost Williams in the Constructors' Championship. So I think a bit of a fortunate situation for Williams. But if he performs like he did this past season, and Williams are in a tight battle with basically anyone else, any of these other teams, I think Sargent, assuming he doesn't develop, could cost them in the Constructors' Championship. And we know for a team like Williams, where they're not really flush with cash, that prize money is super important. So Sargent developing, getting much closer to Albon on pace is super important to Williams for 2024. Next, Alpine. Alpine is a tough one. I'm gonna go very, very simple. Power. That's what Alpine needs. And you know, power is a very, very simple word, but I think the best way to explain it is that the engine, it seems like the engine around, the rumor is the engine's around 30 horsepower compared to the other three. So that's one thing. And the second is that the way that the engine is integrated into the car, into the chassis, means that the cooling is very inefficient, which means that there's more drag. So it's a car doesn't have a ton of power, and it's also, the cooling is very inefficient, which means it's very draggy, which means that, you know, we saw on tracks like Monaco, for example, where it's not a power limited circuit, where it's basically all just max downforce. Alpine did very well. Ocon got a podium. So I think, you know, if they were able to figure out those problems, both the power and the cooling, I know basically power they can't really do a whole lot with, but cooling they definitely can do, because the engine rules are frozen. But, you know, we could see, if they were able to deal with that, they could be fighting up with McLaren, with Aston. Obviously, it depends on what happens, how they do over the winter. But I do think that is the one thing holding them back at the moment. That's the one thing that they're going to be wanting most going into next year. Aston Martin. Okay, so there's two things that you could go with here. I think this is probably going to be the big one. Stroll consistency. So we saw at the beginning of the season, the very first race, Stroll had a pretty good result, finished in 6th. A couple races to go at the end of the season, he came 5th in Brazil, and 5th in Brazil, and 5th in Las Vegas. You know, those were really good results. All the races in between were not so good. And you can make a really good argument. It cost them 4th place in the Constructors' Championship to McLaren. You can also make the argument that, you know, Alpine or Aston Martin are really going to be hoping that they can actually bring upgrades that work next year, and that could have definitely helped them finish ahead of McLaren. But they showed at the start of 2023 that bringing in a new iteration of car, and through 2022 that they could bring out upgrades and they could work well. I do think that, you know, it's basically a one-off, the failed upgrades in 2023. If that happens again in 2024, it's definitely a trend. But I think the more pressing issue for Aston Martin at the moment is Stroll's inconsistency. We know on his good days, he can be a perfectly average, perfectly reasonable Formula 1 driver. He's never going to be a world champion or anything like that. But we know on his good days, he's honestly not too bad. The problem is, those good days are too far and few between. Okay, for McLaren, I think this is probably the big one. A strong start. So last 2 seasons, McLaren have come out of the gate an absolute disaster. 2022, they were very, very slow. They were absolutely awful the first couple races. 2023, they were somehow even worse, but they managed to develop their way out of that. And if they can come into 2024 with a very strong package from the first race, and they can kind of keep the same rate of development up that they've been able to the last 2 years, they could be in a very strong place in 2024. But of course, that means that relies on them having a good winter, building a strong car, and coming out of the gates, being able to compete at the front. Not necessarily with Red Bull, but at least at the front. Then we get to Ferrari. Ferrari, I think Ferrari and Mercedes are in very similar spots, so they may be, and they may end up being very similar. But I do think that for Ferrari, I think that probably the most important thing that for them going into next year is, I think I'm gonna go with this. Stability, and this can be in so many different ways. I think that organizationally, this is finally going to be Vassar's first car as team principal, where it's like entirely on him. Of course, they're going to be continuing with Leclerc and Sainz, and I think they just need to have a lot of stability on the organizational front. Obviously, they're bringing in a new car, and hopefully that car they can kind of get the most out of that car and not have any kind of interferences, any technical directives that basically set the development off for 2 years, which is effectively what happened. They basically took them until the end of this season, end of 2023, to kind of make up for the technical directive that came in mid-2022, because their 2023 car was based on designs that worked before that. So I think having that stability, not having these new technical directives or anything like that mid-season will help them. I think understanding their car and being able to build forwards without any kind of radical changes to within the team or within the regulations, I think will help Ferrari. Last two, so Mercedes. For Mercedes, I think this is going to be pretty simple. Consistency. And I do not mean their drivers, Russell or Hamilton. Their drivers are excellent, and they're definitely not the thing holding back Mercedes at the moment. The thing that I think we all know is holding back Mercedes is consistency. They'll have races where they look absolutely amazing. Kota this past season looked very good. Hamilton almost got a win. Of course, he got disqualified, but he almost did get that win on track. Of course, Hungary, Hamilton gets the pole position. 2022, they get the pole. Well, it wasn't a pole, it was Magnussen's pole, but they basically started the Grand Prix from P1, and they won the Grand Prix with a 1-2. Those are excellent results, right? But in between those excellent results, you have so many races where they go into the weekend and they have absolutely no idea how they're going to perform. Then after qualifying, after the race, they're kind of just completely befuddled about how they ended up with that result. So I think for Mercedes, getting that consistency and also getting that proper correlation between the wind tunnel and the track is going to be a big desire for them, given that it's something that they definitely struggle with. Now, last up, I think Red Bull. I think they had an amazing season, almost perfect. I guess they lost that one race in Singapore. I think for them, I do think that unless they have an absolute disaster over the winter, they should come into 2024 with a pretty strong car. And I think for them, really, their biggest challenge is going to be getting the Constructors' Championship. If any of these cars, probably not Aston Martin, sorry Stroll, can bring a really strong car. And I think for them, the one thing that could be their weakness or Achilles heel is Sergio Perez. So I'm going to put Perez form. And it's really about Perez basically needs to be good enough over the course of the season that not just 4 races like he was this past season, but he needs to be strong enough over the course of the entire season that it does not cost Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. And that's really going to be what Red Bull are looking for this coming season. They're going to, more than anything else, I think they want to make sure that they're going to want a Perez that can come to every Grand Prix weekend, qualify in the top 10, finish in the top 4, let's just say, every single weekend and be consistent about it. That's not the Perez we got this past season, but that's what they're going to want. I was kind of trying to crunch some numbers in my head about, at what point would any of these teams start, what kind of margin and race pace would these teams start to be a problem for Red Bull and for Perez? Now, I'm guessing it's about 1/10 of a second, 1/10.5 of a second is about the margin you're going to be looking at where the Constructors' Championship could be at risk, just because Perez, I think, is a step below the number 2 drivers on Mercedes, Ferrari, and on McLaren. So for Red Bull, just to sum up, his form and his consistency is going to be Red Bull's biggest wish going into 2024. So that's all for this Christmas video. What all 10 Formula 1 teams are going to be wanting most for Christmas going into the new year 2024. Thank you so much for watching. Merry Christmas and goodbye.